She spent a decade being judged for the color of her skin and her minimum wage job. But when a black waitress confronts a racist customer, she uncovers a shocking truth. He's the billionaire father who abandoned her. What happens next will leave you speechless. Grace Thompson adjusted the straps of her worn apron as she walked into the bustling diner on the edge of the city. The smell of burnt coffee and sizzling bacon greeted her, blending with the murmurs of customers hunched over their plates. For the past 5 years, this diner had been Grace's second home, a place where she poured cups of coffee and smiled through gritted teeth at customers who barely saw her as human. Grace wasn't new to the hard knocks of life. At just 25, she'd experienced a lifetime's worth of struggle, raised by her grandmother after her father disappeared and her mother succumbed to an illness. Grace had grown up understanding that the world often had little compassion for people who looked like her. As a black woman in a predominantly white town, she was no stranger to subtle stares, whispered slurs, and the unspoken rules that kept people like her at the bottom. But Grace had learned to persevere. Her grandmother had taught her the value of kindness, even when the world was unkind. "Hold your head high, baby," her grandmother would say. "Don't let their hate make you bitter. You've got a light inside you, and no one can take that away." Even now, as Grace faced the daily grind of double shifts and demanding customers, she clung to those words. Still, the cracks were beginning to show. It was just past noon when the diner reached its usual lunch rush. Grace hurried from table to table, refilling drinks and taking orders, her warm smile masking the exhaustion she felt. "Another black coffee, extra cream," a gruff voice barked from table 7. She turned to see a middle-aged man in a crisp suit, his sharp features twisted into a scowl. "Yes, sir. Right away," Grace replied, her voice even. As she walked away, she felt his eyes bore into her. She knew that look, cold, judgmental, and brimming with disdain. Moments later, as she set the cup down in front of him, the man muttered something under his breath. "Excuse me?" Grace asked, her heart pounding. She had heard the word, lazy, uttered with venom. "I said, it must be nice not to have any real responsibilities," he replied, his tone dripping with condescension. Grace felt her cheeks flush with a mix of anger and shame. She clenched her fists at her sides, forcing herself to remain calm. She couldn't afford to lose this job, not with bills piling up and eviction notices arriving like clockwork. But something inside her snapped. For years, she had swallowed every insult, endured every slight. Not today. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "I may be just a waitress to you, but I work hard every single day to support myself. I won't stand here and let you demean me." The man's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing as he leaned back in his chair. For a moment, he said nothing, his gaze locked on hers. Then, in a low voice, he replied, "You have no idea who you're talking to." Grace's chest tightened. There was something eerily familiar about the man's tone, something that stirred a long-buried memory. She glanced at his hands, polished, strong, and oddly recognizable. Her breath caught as her gaze flicked to his face, the sharp jawline, the piercing eyes, the faint scar above his left eyebrow. It couldn't be. But as the realization hit her, she felt the ground shift beneath her. The man sitting in front of her wasn't just another customer. He was the man who had walked out of her life 10 years ago. Her father. Grace's world seemed to tilt as she stood frozen in place, the din of the crowded diner fading into a... She stared at the man sitting before her, trying to reconcile the memories of her childhood with the reality of the person before her. Her billionaire father was the same man who had just belittled her as if she were nothing. Her mind raced. The scar above his left eyebrow, the same one she used to trace with her small fingers when he'd tuck her in at night. His voice, sharper now with age, but unmistakably familiar. Memories she thought she had buried long ago came rushing back. The nights he'd kiss her forehead, the promises of forever he'd whisper into her ear before disappearing one day, without warning or goodbye. "Is there a problem?" the man said sharply, breaking her trance. Grace blinked, suddenly aware of the stares from nearby customers. The tension between them was palpable. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but instead she clenched her fists, feeling the humiliation rise in her chest. She couldn't break down here. Not in front of him, not in front of everyone. "No," she replied stiffly, her voice barely above a whisper. "No problem," but her hands trembled as she turned to leave the table. In the kitchen, Grace leaned against the counter, her breaths coming in shallow bursts. "Breathe, Grace," she whispered to herself, gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her co-worker, Lisa, noticed her distress. "Hey, are you okay?" Lisa asked, placing a hand on Grace's shoulder. Grace forced a weak smile. "Just a tough customer." But it wasn't just a tough customer. It was the man who had abandoned her and her mother. The man who had left them to struggle while he built an empire. Grace felt a mixture of rage and heartbreak bubbling inside her. She peeked through the small kitchen window, watching him sip his coffee with an air of entitlement, scrolling through his phone as if nothing in the world could touch him. She thought about the years she and her mother spent in near poverty, how her mom worked 2 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads, the birthdays her father missed, the nights Grace cried herself to sleep, wondering why he didn't love her enough to stay. Her mother had tried to shield her from the truth, always offering vague answers when Grace asked about him. "He had his reasons," her mom would say, her voice tight. "But we don't need him, baby. We're stronger on our own." But Grace had needed him. She had dreamed of the day he'd return, of the day he'd walk through the door and explain everything. That day never came, and now, after all these years, he was sitting in her section, unaware of who she was, or worse, pretending not to know. The thought lit a fire inside her. Before she could second-guess herself, Grace stormed back out to the dining area. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she approached the table, her footsteps deliberate and heavy. "Is there something else I can get you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm raging within her. He glanced up, his expression mildly irritated. "No, I'm fine. Just make sure this doesn't take too long. I have a meeting to get to." That tone. That dismissive, cold tone. It was the same one she'd heard in her nightmares, the one that said she wasn't worth his time. Grace leaned in slightly, her voice trembling but filled with resolve. "Do you recognize me?" His brow furrowed, and for a moment there was silence. Then he smirked. "Should I?" The response was a knife to her heart. Whether he truly didn't recognize her or was pretending not to, it cut just the same. "Grace," she said, her voice firm now. "Grace Thompson." "Ring any bells?" His smirk faded. She saw it, the flicker of recognition in his eyes. His jaw tightened, and he leaned back slightly, as if trying to create distance. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice low and guarded. But Grace wasn't backing down. "Don't lie to me," she snapped, her voice louder now. Several heads turned toward the table, curious about the commotion. "You know exactly who I am." "Keep your voice down," he hissed, glancing nervously around the diner. Grace felt a bitter laugh escape her lips. "Why? Are you afraid someone might find out that the great billionaire Richard Ellis abandoned his black daughter and her mother 10 years ago?" The room fell silent. His face paled as he stared at her, his polished demeanor cracking under the weight of her words. "I think you should leave," Richard said finally, his voice cold. But Grace stood her ground, her voice trembling with anger and pain. "You left me, Richard. You left us to fend for ourselves while you built your empire. And now you walk in here and act like I'm nothing to you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had waited her whole life to confront him, and she wasn't about to let him dismiss her again. "Why did you leave?" she demanded, her voice breaking. Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, Grace saw something flicker across his face. Guilt, perhaps, or shame. "Grace," he began, but she shook her head. "Don't," she said, her voice a whisper now. "Don't say my name like you care." The diner had fallen eerily silent, every pair of eyes in the room locked on Grace and the man who now sat stiffly before her. Richard Ellis, the billionaire tycoon who graced magazine covers and business news, suddenly seemed much smaller under the weight of his daughter's gaze. Grace stood trembling, her breath shaky as she waited for the answer she had longed to hear for over a decade. But he said nothing. "Nothing to say?" Grace asked bitterly, her voice louder now. "After all these years, you don't even have the decency to explain why you left us." "Grace, this isn't the time or place," Richard replied, in a low, controlled tone, his eyes darting to the gawking patrons around them. "The time or place?" Grace repeated, incredulous. "You think I care about your dignity after what you did? You left my mother to struggle, to raise me on her own while you— What? Built your empire, lived in your mansions." Richard flinched at the words, but his silence only fueled her anger. "Do you even know what it was like for us?" Grace pressed, her voice breaking despite her resolve. "Do you know how many nights I cried myself to sleep, wondering if you even thought about me? Wondering if I wasn't good enough for you to stay?" Richard's expression hardened, his jaw tightening. "It's not that simple, Grace." Grace let out a bitter laugh, tears brimming in her eyes. "Of course it isn't. It's never simple when it comes to people like you, is it? You can justify anything with the right excuse, can't you?" Richard ran a hand over his face, his polished composure slipping further. "This isn't the place for this conversation," he repeated, his tone clipped. Grace leaned closer, her voice trembling with raw emotion. "You think I care about your reputation? These people," she gestured to the diners, who were now openly whispering and pointing. "They'll forget about this by dinner. But me? I've lived with this every single day for 10 years. So don't you dare tell me this isn't the time or place." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. Grace noticed something flicker in his eyes. Guilt, or maybe fear. For the first time, it seemed like her words had reached him. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I didn't abandon you," he said softly, his voice barely audible. Grace's heart clenched at the words, anger sparking anew. "You didn't abandon me?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You walked out on me and my mum with nothing but a vague excuse and no explanation. What would you call it then?" Richard's gaze dropped to the table, and for a moment he seemed lost in thought. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "I left to protect you." Grace blinked, taken aback. "Protect me?" she said, incredulous. "Protect me from what?" "From having a father." Richard met her gaze, and this time his expression was steady, though there was a sadness in his eyes that Grace hadn't noticed before. "You don't understand, Grace," he said. "The world I was in. It wasn't safe. For you, for your mother. I thought you'd be better off without me." Grace stared at him, her mind racing. Was this some kind of twisted justification? A weak attempt to excuse his absence? "You thought we'd be better off struggling to survive?" Grace asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You thought it was better for my mother to work herself to death just to keep a roof over our heads? That it was better for me to grow up wondering why I wasn't enough for you to stay? I didn't want you to grow up in my shadow," Richard said, his voice breaking slightly. "I made Grace. Mistakes that could have destroyed you too. Walking away was the hardest thing I've ever done. But I thought it was the right thing." Grace shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You don't get to decide what's right for me. You don't get to disappear and then act like you were some noble hero trying to protect me." Richard reached out as if to touch her arm, but she pulled away sharply. "Grace, I know I can't change the past," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I'm here now. I'm ready to make things right, if you'll let me." Grace's laughter was bitter and hollow. "Make things right? How? With your money? Your empty apologies? You don't get to waltz back into my life and fix everything with a check." Richard looked genuinely pained, and for a moment the two simply stared at each other, the weight of the years between them pressing down like a heavy fog. Finally Grace stepped back, her hands trembling. "You can't fix this," she said quietly. "Some things can't be fixed." With that, she turned and walked away, her vision blurred by tears. She could hear Richard calling her name, but she didn't stop. She pushed through the kitchen doors and into the alley behind the diner, where she collapsed against the wall, sobbing. For 10 years, she had dreamed of confronting her father. She had imagined this moment over and over, thinking it would bring her closure. But now, all she felt was emptiness. As she wiped her tears, Grace realized one thing. Her father wasn't the answer to the pain she carried. If she was going to heal, it wouldn't be because of him. It would be because of her. Richard Ellis sat frozen in the diner booth, his hands gripping the edge of the table, as if it were the only thing tethering him to the earth. Around him, the whispers of curious onlookers swirled, but he barely registered them. His focus was on the swinging kitchen door, through which Grace had stormed moments ago. He had always imagined what it might be like to see her again, but never like this. Not in the middle of a diner, not with such raw anger and pain in her voice, and certainly not with the realization that his carefully constructed justification for leaving her life had crumbled in an instant. He replayed her words in his mind. "You don't get to disappear, and then act like you were protecting me." Each syllable cut deeper than the last. "Mr. Ellis?" a waitress said hesitantly, snapping him out of his trance. "Are you okay? Should I bring you something else?" Richard shook his head, forcing a polite smile. "No, thank you. I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. He doubted he ever would be. Slowly he stood and walked out of the diner, his movements mechanical. Once outside, he leaned against his sleek black car, taking a deep breath. The warmth of the midday sun did little to thaw the cold regret that had settled in his chest. I shouldn't have come here. But deep down, he knew it wasn't chance that had brought him to this diner. A few months ago, during a routine financial review of his philanthropic ventures, he had come across a report on Grace's town. He had seen her name, her full name, in a list of local residents. Something had stirred inside him then, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. He had told himself he'd just take a look, see how she was doing from a distance. He wasn't ready to face her, not yet. But when he saw her, standing there in her uniform, working tirelessly with that same determination she had as a little girl, his resolve had crumbled. "And now I've made everything worse." He turned and looked back at the diner. He could see Grace through the window, wiping tears from her face as she talked to another waitress. The sight broke him. Later that night, Richard sat alone in his penthouse, staring out at the city lights that stretched endlessly before him. His home was filled with every luxury imaginable, priceless art on the walls, furniture imported from across the globe. But tonight, it all felt empty. On the desk beside him was a photograph he hadn't looked at in years. It was small, the edges worn from time, but the image was crystal clear. A younger version of himself holding a laughing little girl on his shoulders. Grace. Her smile had been wide, her eyes sparkling with the boundless joy only a child could have. What happened to that smile, he wondered. He knew the answer, of course. He had taken it away the day he left. For years, Richard had convinced himself that leaving Grace and her mother was the right decision. His world had been messy then, rife with dangerous deals, rivals who wouldn't think twice about using his family against him. He thought he was doing the noble thing by walking away. But as he sat in his cold, silent penthouse, he saw his actions for what they truly were. Selfish. He reached for the phone on his desk, dialing a number he hadn't called in years. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Richard? Hello, Evelyn," he said softly. "It's been a long time." The silence on the other end was heavy. "What do you want?" Evelyn finally asked, her tone guarded. "I saw Grace today," Richard admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "It didn't go well." Evelyn sighed. "What did you expect, Richard? You disappeared. You left us with nothing. Grace spent years trying to piece herself back together. You don't just get to waltz back into her life like nothing happened." "I know," he said quickly. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But Evelyn, I want to make it right. Please, help me." Her laughter was bitter. "You think you can fix this with money, don't you? That's all you've ever known. But Grace doesn't need your money. She needed her father, and you weren't there." Richard swallowed hard, the truth of her words hitting him like a punch to the gut. "I'm not asking for a second chance to be her father," he said quietly. I just want her to know that I care." that I never stopped caring. Evelyn's tone softened slightly. You want my advice? Stop thinking about what you want. Start thinking about what Grace needs. If you're serious about this, you'll listen to her. Let her tell you what she wants. Richard nodded, even though she couldn't see him. He promised. The next day, Richard found himself parked outside Grace's apartment building. He sat in his car for over an hour, his nerves getting the best of him. Finally, he stepped out, clutching an envelope in his hand. He knocked on the door and waited, his heart pounding. When Grace opened it, her expression immediately hardened. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone icy. "I'm not here to make excuses," Richard said, holding up his hands. "I just want to give you this." He handed her the envelope. Grace stared at it warily before opening it. Inside was a letter, handwritten, the words painstakingly crafted. "Grace, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect you to believe me when I say I regret every second I wasn't there for you. But I do, more than I can put into words. You deserved better, and I failed you. I let my fear dictate my actions, and I made the biggest mistake of my life when I left. I can't undo the past, but if there's even the smallest chance I can be part of your life again, I'll do whatever it takes. I'm not asking for anything from you. I just want you to know I've never stopped loving you. Dad." Grace read the letter in silence, her fingers trembling as she held the paper. When she looked up at Richard, her eyes were unreadable. "Do you mean it?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Richard said without hesitation. For a long moment, Grace said nothing. Then, with a deep breath, she stepped aside and opened the door wider. Richard stepped into Grace's small apartment, his presence somehow feeling too large for the modest space. The walls were adorned with framed photos of Grace's life. Her high school graduation, a picture of her late mother, and a few candid shots with friends. These were moments Richard had never been a part of, and the weight of his absence settled heavily on his chest. Grace motioned to the couch, her movements stiff and reluctant. "You can sit, I guess," she said, her tone guarded. Richard obeyed, lowering himself onto the worn fabric. "Thank you for letting me in," he said softly, his voice tinged with gratitude and apprehension. Grace didn't respond right away. Instead, she leaned against the wall, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if she were bracing herself against him. "I don't know why I let you in," she said finally, her voice low and uncertain. "I guess I just needed to hear what you have to say." Richard nodded, taking a deep breath to steady himself. "I know I hurt you, Grace. I know my leaving. It left a hole in your life, one that no apology can ever fill." Grace's jaw tightened, but she didn't interrupt. "For years I told myself I was doing the right thing," Richard continued. "I convinced myself that you and your mother would be better off without me. My world was dangerous back then. Cutthroat business deals, threats from competitors, people who would have used you to get to me. I thought walking away would protect you. But it didn't," Grace said, her voice sharp. "Do you have any idea what it was like for us? We didn't need protection, Richard. We needed you. My mom needed you. Instead, she worked herself into the ground trying to keep us afloat while you—" "What? Played hero in your corporate world?" Her words cut deep, but Richard didn't flinch. "You're right," he admitted. "I failed both of you. I thought I was doing the noble thing, but I was a coward. I didn't want to face the mess I'd made. And by the time I realized how wrong I was, I thought it was too late." Grace's arms dropped to her sides, her expression softening slightly. "So why now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why come back after all this time?" Richard hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because I couldn't stay away anymore," he said finally. "I saw your name in a report a few months ago, and I had to know if you were okay. When I saw you in the diner, I knew I couldn't keep hiding. I had to face you, even if you hated me for it." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "Do you even know how hard it's been for me? For years, I blamed myself. I thought I wasn't good enough for you to stay. And then, when I got older, I blamed you. I hated you for what you did to us. I know," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I don't blame you for hating me. I hate myself for it too." For a long moment, the room was silent, the tension between them heavy, but not as suffocating as before. Grace stared at him, searching his face for sincerity. "Do you really mean it?" she asked, her voice soft. "Everything you said in the letter, do you mean it?" "Yes," Richard replied without hesitation. "Every word. I don't expect you to forgive me, Grace. But I'm here, and if you'll let me, I want to be part of your life again. Whatever that looks like, whatever it takes." Grace swallowed hard, her emotions warring within her. She wanted to scream at him, to make him feel the pain she had carried for so long. But she also wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that her father, the man she had loved so fiercely as a child, could still care for her. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said finally. "Not yet. But maybe someday." Richard nodded, a faint glimmer of hope flickering in his eyes. "I'll wait as long as it takes," he said. Grace gave a small, hesitant nod. "If you're serious about this, it's not going to be easy. You don't just get to walk back in and pretend the past didn't happen." "I know," Richard said. "I'll do whatever it takes. I just want to make things right." Over the next few weeks, Richard and Grace began the slow, tentative process of rebuilding their relationship. Richard made regular visits to her apartment, each time bringing small gestures of care, a home-cooked meal, a bouquet of flowers, or just an ear to listen. He shared stories of his life, admitting to the mistakes he had made and the regrets that had haunted him. Grace, in turn, opened up about her struggles, her mother's death, her financial hardships, and the scars left by his absence. It wasn't easy. There were days when Grace lashed out, her anger bubbling to the surface. But Richard didn't run this time. He stayed, listening, apologizing, and proving through his actions that he was committed to earning her trust. One evening, as they sat on Grace's couch watching an old movie, she turned to him and asked, "Do you regret it? Leaving us?" Richard looked at her, his expression solemn. "Every day," he said. "But I'm grateful for this chance to make things right. I'll never take it for granted." Grace nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I'm not saying we're there yet, but we're getting closer." And for the first time in years, Grace felt a flicker of hope, not just for herself, but for the possibility of healing the wounds left by the past.